Okay, I want to talk about something called the Gunpowder Empires. Now, I talked last time about how the Mongols come sweeping out of Central Asia and they conquer the Middle East pretty easily, and a big part of that was their bows and arrows and their horses, etc. But after the Mongols, the Mongol empires really collapsed in the 1300s, and they're pretty much gone by the 1400s. But after the Mongols, you see this new thing emerge, which is gunpowder empires. Now, the Mongols had used gunpowder a little bit. They had some primitive gunpowder weapons. But it's really in the 1400s that you see the advent of the cannon. And by the early 1500s, you're starting to see gunpowder armies where a significant number, you have significant numbers of cannons, but then also even handheld weapons that begin to fundamentally change warfare. Now, the advent of gunpowder weapons would allow for the creation of three new Muslim empires. Two of them are in the Middle East, so I'm going to talk about them some. One was not. The Mughal dynasty was in northern India, and that's outside of the Middle East. It was a Muslim empire, but it was a gunpowder empire, but it was outside of the Middle East, so I'm not going to talk about that again. But the Safavid Empire in Persia and the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia, Syria, Iraq, etc., and around Egypt is a major gunpowder empire. And the Ottoman Empire is really a major influence in the Middle East for hundreds and hundreds of years. So we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire for a lot in this lecture. But first I want to just get into what does gunpowder mean to an army? Why is gunpowder important? And there's a couple things going on here. The first is that before gunpowder armies, you had soldiers usually on horseback were the sort of standard, most potent soldier, and they would to have soldiers on horseback, especially if they're going to be shooting arrows from horseback. They have to be really skilled. I mean, riding horses is a skill, and riding horses well enough to be really good soldiers, cavalry, is an even greater skill. But then being able to fight on horseback, being able to sword fight, use a spear or a lance, fire off arrows, those are real skills that take years and years of training. So what you see is that with pre-gunpowder armies, you tended to have fairly small armies. I mean, they could get to tens of thousands, but fairly small armies because it's hard to get together that many highly skilled people. And in particular, if you're going to have somebody have those kind of skills, they have to spend a lifetime doing it. So you have to have a situation where somebody can spend a lifetime doing that, right? And that's part of why the Turks and the Mongols, these nomadic peoples in Central Asia, were good soldiers because they spent their whole lives on horseback anyway, herding animals and things like that. So they had half of the battle won right there. They just had to learn the military side, the weapons handling. Whereas people in settled agricultural communities, most of the population doesn't have time to learn how to ride horses and learn how to fight on horseback, etc. So what you get instead for a lot of history, and I'll set aside the nomadic peoples for a minute, is you get a small aristocracy or an upper class who are wealthy, they own a lot of land, they tax the population, etc., but they have the time to train themselves to be good soldiers. And so you have the European aristocratic knights, and you have the daimyo in Japan, and you have, etc. And in the Middle East, you have, aristocratic upper classes who often train as the soldiers, or they command the armies at least. And then you can fill out an army with relatively untrained, foot soldiers. But they're not the bulk of the army. The bulk of the army, or the real heart of the army, is the cavalry, the highly trained cavalry. But gunpowder changes all that. Because, essentially, gunpowder allows it's fairly easy to learn how to fire a gun, I'll put it that way. To learn how to become proficient with a gun as a soldier, it takes weeks or maybe a couple months of training. Whereas to learn how to be proficient as a cavalry to fight on horseback is years and years. And so what you get with gunpowder then is that it's possible to take a completely illiterate peasant with no military training and no skills and spend several months teaching them how to march and fire a weapon, and they can take out a highly trained cavalry soldier who's spent his whole lifetime learning the skills of warfare, because you might be great at fighting, sword fighting, but if the peasant can shoot you from 100 yards away, your sword fighting doesn't matter, right? So what happens with the gunpowder army is that there's a gradual shift, and I do want to point out this is gradual, because initially when gunpowder emerges in armies, they have a few cannons but not many. Then they have more cannons, and then they finally start to get handheld weapons, but the handheld weapons fire so slowly that they don't become the major weapon for a while. It's over time that gunpowder becomes more and more the major force of an army. But by the 1600s, certainly, you're talking about gunpowder and gunpowder weapons being the major weapons in the military. And certainly by the 1700s, people aren't even wearing armor, carrying swords. Officers carry decorative swords, but really there's no real hand-to-hand fighting to speak of by the 1700s. You're talking about armies blasting away at each other from long distances with guns. So what happens then is that armies shift between about the late 1400s and the 1700s. Over about 200 years there, armies shift from being largely handheld, hand-to-hand combat weapons and bows and arrows to being gunpowder weapons. But this shift has enormous implications for the society. This shift to gunpowder weapons doesn't just require that you re-equip your army. It actually requires that you restructure the government and in many ways restructure society itself. Let me explain why. So you want to have an army, and it's fairly easy to train a bunch of soldiers fairly quickly, and then they can fight pretty effectively, and they can take out a highly trained army. And so that means it's cheaper to train more soldiers, right? But gunpowder armies, you don't have to invest in as much in each soldier, because pre-gunpowder armies, you have to invest in a lifetime of training for a soldier. But in gunpowder armies, you don't. It's just several months or maybe a year or whatever that you train a soldier. So adding each soldier is cheap. But in the long run, armies get more expensive. And the reason is that once you have a slightly trained peasant with a gun who is able to kill a highly trained soldier without a gun, armies go from valuing quality to valuing quantity. Because when you've got armies on cavalry charging at each other and fighting hand to hand, a small number of really effective soldiers can be an enormous can just blow away the competition. I mean, we saw that in the Crusades, that the Crusaders had this heavy armor and these huge horses, and the Crusaders could go into battle at 10-1 against Muslims in many cases and win, because a small number of highly trained and well-armed soldiers were effective against lightly armed or lighter trained soldiers. And so the quality of the European Crusaders and the quality of their advantage over the Muslims they were fighting meant that they could go into battle outnumbered 10-1 and have a pretty good chance of winning. But once you get gunpowder, now the quality of the European Crusaders doesn't matter. I mean, there's a great novel called The Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. It was written by Mark Twain. And there's a scene in there where this guy from 19th century America winds up getting transported back to basically King Arthur's England. But he's supposed to fight a duel with this, or not a duel, but a tournament, a joust with this other knight, and the knight's all up in full armor and everything, and this guy knows he doesn't know what he's doing, so he just pulls out a handgun and shoots the guy, and it goes right through his armor and kills him. And that's essentially what you get. Now you've got peasants with no training whatsoever who can shoot highly trained knights, and it doesn't matter how much armor, how much training, etc. that knight has, the bullet's going to kill him. And so the quality of the soldiers doesn't matter as much. Instead, having 2 peasants who can fire a gun is twice as effective as 1 peasant who can fire a gun. And having 4 peasants who can fire a gun is twice as effective as 2. And having 10,000 peasants who can fire guns is twice as effective as having 5,000 peasants. And so what you begin to see happen, and this is not a linear path, but you begin to see armies getting bigger and bigger, because adding each additional peasant with a gun is pretty cheap. And having more guns in the field makes your army more effective, because quantity is what matters now. More guns are better. And the individual quality of the peasant holding the gun doesn't matter that much. As long as they can fire it, they can have some effect. Right? So it becomes basically, instead of having a bunch of highly trained soldiers we're going to count on to fight effectively, we're going to have thousands of not very highly trained soldiers, because we're just going to assume we can overwhelm them with quantity. Right? And so what begins to happen then is each soldier is cheaper to train. Each peasant is cheaper to equip and train than a knight in armor. But in the long run, because armies get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, armies get more expensive. Because before you only had to equip, 5,000 knights or 10,000 knights. But now you're having to equip, 150,000 peasants with guns, and you're having to equip, 200,000 peasants with guns. And overall, just as a general trend, and again, this is not an absolute trend. The numbers go up and down depending on what time period you're looking at. But overall, basically, from the Middle Ages up until the 19th century, armies just get bigger and bigger. Okay. Now, again, there are some places where you get really huge armies, and then later you have smaller armies. But the overall trend is clearly that armies get bigger and bigger. I mean, if you look at medieval battles in Europe or the Middle East, you're talking, sometimes you're only talking 5,000-6,000 knights on each side. Sometimes you're talking 10,000. Sometimes you're talking 20,000. If you looked at Muhammad's fights with the Umayyads, his big army at the end, which defeated the Umayyads, was 20,000. But by the time you're talking, the Mongols had 100,000. That was a huge army at the time, and that was bigger than most armies they were facing. Most armies were still in the tens of thousands, 50,000, 70,000. But then you start getting gunpowder, and armies start getting bigger and bigger. By the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon is taking an army of 600,000 soldiers into Russia. And by the time you get to World War I, we're talking armies of 9 to 12 million soldiers. All right? And so you can sort of see here that what happens is, when you start adopting guns, it gives you an immediate advantage. Your armies are better. I mean, you can crush better trained armies because you've got guns and they don't. And so everybody adopts guns because they can see how useful they are. But they quickly realize that gunpowder armies just need to get bigger and bigger. It becomes an arms race. Everybody's trying to get a bigger army than the other guy. And that requires bigger changes. And in particular, gunpowder armies in the long run require more money, because although each soldier is cheaper to equip, the number of soldiers keeps getting bigger and bigger, and so you've got to do more and more of them, right? It costs more to equip 600,000 Napoleonic soldiers than it does to equip 10,000 knights in armor for the Crusades, even though every Napoleonic soldier is cheaper than every knight in armor, because the knight in armor has to have custom-made armor and all that, and a horse, he's expensive. But if there's only 10,000 of them or 20,000 of them, that's still going to be way cheaper than 600,000 cheap gunpowder soldiers. So you need more money, and in particular, you need to buy a lot of weapons. You need to buy a lot of gunpowder. You need to buy a lot of carts and things to carry the gunpowder for the soldiers. You need to buy a lot of uniforms, because once you get armies that are that big, you need to start identifying your guys and their guys. So you need uniforms and things like that. So now you've got to have uniforms, and you've got to have boots, and then now you got to produce a lot of food. Smaller armies could often live off the land they're going through. If you have 10,000 soldiers, you have a fair chance of being able to, take food from peasants on the way past and feed your army. If you have 600,000 soldiers, there's no way they can feed themselves. You need to bring in food from elsewhere, right? Well, so governments now find themselves, if they adopt gunpowder, Now they've got to produce a lot more money. The army gets more expensive, and so they have to find a way to raise more revenue for the government, and they have to find a way to manage all the logistics of a huge army, right? They got to buy all that food and put it all on carts and transport it and hire the people that are going to cook the food for the armies, and they got to contract out for the uniforms, and they got to make the guns, and they've got to make sure they've got suppliers for the gunpowder and all the rest. They've got a lot of work to do. And so one of the things you see is that governments that adopt gunpowder either have to right away or have to develop quickly a big bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is a bunch of officials, government officials, who push paper around basically, but a bureaucracy is necessary if you want to run a gunpowder army. In the Middle Ages, you could say, or the Mongols could just say, send out the word to all the clans in the Mongol people that, everybody send soldiers, we're going to go fight, and everybody would send a bunch of soldiers, and they all show up, and they'd bring their own food, and everybody go off and fight. But with a big gunpowder army, now you've got to have somebody who can figure out how much food you're going to need and order that food and make sure it all gets there in time and cook it, etc. So you need people, you need clerks, you need record keepers, you need people who can requisition things, you need managers, you need, etc. This requires a bureaucracy. It requires a bigger government. And we'll see that the gunpowder empires develop a bigger and more efficient government. And you have to have government departments. You have to have somebody who's in charge of the weapons and the armaments for the army, and then somebody else who's in charge of food and uniforms for the army, and somebody else who's in charge of training the army and training the officer corps and etc. But you also need a bureaucracy to raise money. You need a better tax system because the government has to have a steady income to pay for these big armies. And so you need to have a better way of taxing people, which means you need tax records, and you need tax collectors, and you need tax laws, and all of that. So that's more government clerks to handle that. And if you're going to have a good tax system, you need to know what's being produced. And so you need to actually have good records on how much grain your country produces every year and how much steel it can produce every year and how much, you want to start managing the economy so that you know what your economy can produce for the army, and so that you can efficiently take things from your economy to supply this enormous army you have to build. And so governments have to get bigger, and this becomes a huge force pushing governments to become bigger and bigger with more and more clerks and more departments and more offices to manage all this stuff, right? And in particular, they have to learn how to tax their populations better. But you also have to have people, right? If you're going to build an army of 600,000, you need 600,000 people. And you need to have a way of getting them to serve in the army because they probably aren't going to want to. Right? If you have a small aristocracy and it's the glory of the aristocracy to serve in the army, they're willing to do that. But if you're trying to raise 600,000 peasants and tell them to leave their home and leave their farm and leave their family and go off and fight and maybe die, that's a different level of motivation you need, right? So what governments then have to do is they have to start monitoring their population. They have to start taking census data and figure out how many people they have and who lives where. And they have to start having birth records and death records so they can say, hey, we know that you've got 5 kids, we're drafting one of them for the army. And you have to have, you have to constantly update and monitor this stuff. You need more bureaucracy to monitor the population. So now you've got a big bureaucracy to tax the population. You've got a big bureaucracy to monitor the population and the demographics of it. So you know how many men who are military age there are in this region that you can draft and how many men there are military age in that region. And then you have to have a whole bureaucracy set up to go draft these guys and get them into the army and, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a huge thing. But even beyond that, the government now has to be able to produce weapons and uniforms and boots and gunpowder, et cetera. And so the industrial base behind a gunpowder army has to be bigger and more robust than the industrial base behind a pre-gunpowder army. The Mongols really didn't have much of an industrial base. They traded for weapons, etc. They might be able to make some themselves, but they really didn't need an industrial base. But if you want to equip a huge army with gunpowder and et cetera, you've got to be able to crank out the guns and the gunpowder and the ammunition. You've got to be able to crank out the carts that are going to carry all the gunpowder. You've got to be able to crank all this stuff out. So now the government has to get involved with the production of weapons, because now the government has to start making guns and cannons. And the government has to have factories to do that. And the government has to have another bureaucracy of clerks and things to manage all the factories that are producing all the guns and the carts and et cetera, and the uniforms and all that. And so that means, in a sense, many governments will have to, and we'll talk about this later, will have to start industrializing their economies, right? So gunpowder has ripple effects that first travel throughout the government. The government has to grow and become more efficient and effective to create a gunpowder army. But then that starts to have a ripple effect on the society as society has to change to support a gunpowder army. So gunpowder armies are really a sort of a driver of social and governmental change. And so when an army or a kingdom adopts a gunpowder army, they find themselves having to change all sorts of things as a result. They've got to make a much bigger state. And that's part of why historians call these gunpowder empires. It's like, this is the most important thing about them. This is a new generation of empires that are, because they have a gunpowder-based army, they're going to have all sorts of different tax structures and bureaucracies, and they're going to monitor their population in new ways, and they're going to have to manage their economies in new ways. They're going to have to do a whole bunch of stuff. And so these are a different type of society, a different type of government once you adopt gunpowder. So gunpowder armies, empires, are a huge thing. And you know, we use this phrase for these three empires in the Middle East and India, but you know, England and France and Prussia and Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc., they all become gunpowder empires also with similar results. Right. So let me turn to one of the first gunpowder empires, which is the Safavid Empire. So when Persia got conquered by the Mongols, but then the Mongols basically pull out in the late 1800s, and their empire sort of collapses there. And so Persia is really in chaos, and it would actually remain in chaos for about 100 years. But you begin to see sort of local groups, local strongmen or local organizations or whatever, take control of a small territory in Persia. And then they start to fight with each other to see who's going to sort of be running Persia. Well, one of these groups was in 1890, in the 1400s. There was a religious order, sort of a monastic order, if you will, in northern Persia. It was Sunni. They were Sunni Muslims, and they would train people in various techniques for meditation and prayer and things like that. Well, when Persia sort of falls into chaos, that group starts to sort of act like a government in some ways. They would feed the poor, and they would, maintain order, etc. And so they start to function as basically a government. But they're a religious group. Well, in 1494, their leader, they select as a leader a young man named Ismail. And Ismail is really interesting because he takes the title of Shah, which is the Persian version of king, which is a big statement, right? I'm going to be the king. But he makes a couple of claims that were really interesting. Number one is he claims he's a direct descendant of the seventh Imam of Shia Islam, right? Remember, in Shia Islam, the Imam is like this one guy who's guided by God. He claims to be descendant of the seventh Imam, which would make him eligible to be an Imam, right? He also claims to be under the secret guidance of the occluded 12th Imam. You remember for the Ismailis, the 12th Imam didn't die, he just went into hiding. Well, Ismail here, note the name Ismail also, claims that he is under the guidance of the occluded 12th Imam. So he's claiming huge religious authority as a Shia. And so he basically transforms this religious sect from being Sunni into being Shiite. And then he starts to set out to conquer Persia, and he very quickly does so. He comes to the head of this religious order in 1494. By 1501, he has transformed this religious order, and he has started to conquer Persia as a kingdom. And the so-called Safavid Empire that this is the beginning of would actually rule Persia from about 1501 to 1722. And so the Safavid Empire would become an enormous, a successor to the Persian Empire. But what's interesting about it is they were not initially a gunpowder empire in the early 1500s under Ismail. They're expanding, but they're a traditional bow and arrow type of army. But they run into the Ottomans. In 1514, they fight a battle with the Ottomans at Chaldiran, and the Ottomans bring guns, and the Safavids don't, and the Safavids get their butts kicked, and they lose badly. And so the Ottomans seize control of what we would today call Iraq, Mesopotamia, because of the Battle of Chaldiran. Now, the Ottomans have other stuff going on. We'll see what happens to the Ottomans, and they would turn south to Egypt, etc. So the Safavids, they lose badly, the Ottomans, but they don't get wiped out. They don't get destroyed because the Ottomans are busy going off in other directions. And that gives the Safavids time to say, whoa, we totally got our butts kicked at Chaldiran. Why was that? And they say it was the cannons. And so they start to adopt cannons. They start to figure out what they have to do, and they start to transform their government in order to build a big gunpowder army. And they would then transform themselves into a gunpowder empire. And one of the reasons they would last until 1722 is because they can then hold off the Ottomans after that. They would fight with the Ottomans in the future, but there was always gunpowder army against gunpowder army, and they could hold their own then. But if they had not adopted gunpowder, the Ottomans would have come back at some point and wiped them out. Right? So the Safavid Empire is the first gunpowder empire. Next part of the lecture, I'm going to turn to the Ottomans, who are the sort of biggest of the gunpowder empire.